and welcome to a sports podcast exclusively on my YouTube channel. Today I have Joshua Galbraith with me, and he is from Tennis Australia. He's previously been a ball boy at the Australian Open men's final between Novak Djokovic and Andy Murray. Looks like the tables have turned though, Josh. It looks like Andy Murray's the world number one now and Novak Djokovic is stuck at number two. What do you think about, the whole ranking system?
Yeah, it's certainly been a long time coming. Andy's waited his turn, that's for sure. It's good to see him sort of making a move. It's been a while. Djokovic has been number one for probably 5 or 6 years now. It's good to see Andy make a move, and hopefully 2017 might be his time for a couple of Grand Slam titles, especially one here in Australia.
Because with Andy Murray, there's always that thing of, versing competitors of the likes of Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, Djokovic, and you even have guys outside who can contend quite well, such as Wawrinka. On his day, he just is a very dominant player. And traditionally, Murray has lost those Grand Slams to those athletes who have been at the prime of their careers. But now that, Nadal's struggled with some injuries, Novak Djokovic, who's been incredible over the past few years, make no mistake about that. He recently, not sacked, but he let go his coach in Boris Becker, probably looking for a new change-up. But obviously, there was a tremendous amount of success there, beating Roger Federer in Wimbledon in the final. That's no easy feat. But it looks like Andy Murray, is stepping up his game. Do you think that that's because of his improvement as a player, or is it because the other competitors, they're kind of dropping slightly?
No, I think he's definitely improved, and the gap's clearly closing between probably the top two and the next half a dozen, which is probably exciting for the summer that's coming up here in Australia, with a few of those players who maybe we haven't seen lift the trophy for a while or ever, have their opportunity. One of them hopefully might be an Australian, maybe Kyrgios or Tomic. Might be their time this year, who knows, but the gap's certainly closing, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, and Kyrgios has an abundance of talent. He's a really powerful player, forehand, backhand side. You constantly hear, even the top players like Djokovic, Nadal, Federer saying, if he can get his game together off the court, he could become a really special player, capable of winning not just a Grand Slam, but multiple Grand Slams. Do you think that the Australian Open is not exactly his coming out party, because he's already up there in the rankings, but do you think he could really dig deep into the finals of the Australian Open?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the big players in the world know that he's coming, and coming pretty hard. And I think even though he's got that relaxed sort of attitude, he'll be disappointed with the way his 2016 ended, with a couple of weeks suspension before the end of the year. So he'll be looking to come back pretty hard, and I reckon it'll start in Perth in a few days' time, and then in Melbourne, look out, I reckon, because he's coming hard.
Isn't Roger Federer participating in Perth as well?
He definitely is. First time in a while,
Wow.
I think. So that's exciting for the Hopman Cup to have Roger Federer there playing for Switzerland, and the Aussie team of Gavrilova and Kyrgios trying to defend their title.
Yeah,
exciting.
Is Wawrinka teaming up with Roger Federer, or?
No, because it's a boys and girls event, so one male, one female.
Oh,
so
okay.
I'm not sure who the Swiss girl is that's playing with Roger, but whoever it is, I'm sure they're pretty excited, because not too many opportunities you get to play with the king, so I'm sure they'll be excited.
Absolutely. And traditionally, I think Novak Djokovic used to participate in that tournament with Ana Ivanovic, and recently Ana Ivanovic has retired.
Just this morning, yeah.
Yeah, just this morning, in fact. I was just reading an article. I didn't get to read exactly why. Are you aware of why?
I think she's had quite a number of injuries in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, and probably feels as though she's had her time and had a pretty successful time of it. Grand Slam champion, former world number one, so why not call it quits now?
Yeah, and that's always a thing where it's hard sometimes to know when retirement is creeping up on you. I mean, Federer's in his mid-30s, but he's always had that consistent level of play, which is one of the reasons why they call him like the greatest tennis player ever, because he's developed that consistency. And it just shows you that how taxing the tennis game can be. You've seen Nadal have, tendonitis issues in his knees. Anna Ivanovic has had a few injuries as well. So it's just part of the game, really. When are you going to decide to retire? Because she could still play on. She still has the game to match, even someone like Serena Williams, who's, on top of her game, obviously. But, she was constantly in or around the top 10 of the women's game. And I wish her, a great career post-tennis. She was no doubt a terrific tennis player who really enjoyed the Australian Open. Do you know those, what's it called? Those interviews they do with the players, like, in the car or whatever? Yeah. She constantly talked about, how much she liked Melbourne. And you always get that with tennis players. They always say that the Australian Open is one of the best run Grand Slams. Being involved with Tennis Australia intricately, why do you think that is?
I think the big push from Tennis Australia is always the player first attitude. So the intention of all staff and all people around the tournament is to look after the players, and I think that's why the players continually love coming back to Melbourne. From the tournament director Craig Tiley to the last ball kid who's at the bottom of the tree, so to speak, every single staff member makes sure that every player enjoys their 2 weeks in Melbourne, or whether it's 2 days, depending on how long they go through the tournament. And I think that's why so many of them pick Melbourne as their favourite tournament of the year. And there's all the prestigious ones of Wimbledon and that kind of tournament, but I think Melbourne is known as the Happy Slam as well. It's just a really vibrant, really exciting atmosphere around Melbourne Park for 2 weeks every January, and it starts off every season with a bit of a bang, and it always sort of throws up something that we haven't expected. Always a player who we haven't expected to come through and just make a run through to the quarterfinals or something and start their 2017 season. Hopefully we might see one or two of those Aussies make that run, like we did with Gavrilova last year. Who knows who that might be in 2017.
Mm-hmm. And you've got someone like Bernard Tomic's sister coming up through the ranks, and apparently she's a really bright prospect in the women's game. Is she in the seniors now, or is she still in the juniors?
No, I watched her in the December Showdown a couple of weeks ago in the under-18 juniors, and she was pretty impressive. She was looking pretty dominant, and then she came out a week later and played in the Wildcard Championships, which was for a spot in the Australian Open. She didn't quite get there, but she's coming, similarly like her brother, she's coming pretty hard towards the women's competition, and it's certainly an exciting time for the Tomic family in Australian tennis, with her and her brother and plenty of other young Aussies coming up and coming forward.
Imagine being Bernard Tomic's sister, Sarah, and is that her name, Sarah or Sarah? Yeah, Sarah. And having that, sounding board in Bernard Tomic to go off. I mean, it's a great thing because, Tomic started his career as, he was talked up as, one of Australia's brightest prospects ever, really. I mean, when he made that Wimbledon run and he made the quarters, he was only very young. I think he versed Djokovic before he bowed out of the tournament. But, he was hyped up a lot. And in recent times, he's been living up to the hype. But before that, it's been a bit of a struggle for Tomic, and indeed any player coming up through the tennis ranks now. It's extremely hard for young players to make a run in the top 10 when you have really experienced players in there. Tsonga, Wawrinka's winning, a few Grand Slams. So you have to train hard. And admittedly, I think Tomic would admit he hasn't got the best out of himself all the time. Some small off-court issues. But he seems to be developing his game really well at the moment. He's still young. I think he's, in his early 20s. So, and curious as well. He looks like a really bright prospect. So it's about nurturing these young players, especially, when they're talking about Tennis Australia. It's about, having kind of respect for those kind of organisations. Because I remember Tomic had a bit of an argument in a press conference at Wimbledon. He was talking about Craig Tiley and how it wasn't run properly. You need to unite the players. There needs to be something both inside and outside the tennis game. And in general, who do you think are the brightest prospects at next year's Australian Open? Roger Federer is coming back. Seems unlikely that he can just come back and win a Grand Slam straight away. But with the genius that he possesses, who knows? Andy Murray, we talked about, is looking very strong, in very strong form. Have you got anyone from the male or female side?
I think obviously Andy Murray is probably the one to beat, but I think one that we probably haven't talked about yet, Kai Nishikori.
Yes.
Last probably 2 years he's made quarterfinals, fourth round quarterfinal sort of time, but I reckon this could be his time. He's really progressed probably in the last 3 years from around the top 100 to breaking into the top 10 and being consistent part of the top 10 in the last 12 to 18 months. And I think of ones who haven't won a Grand Slam yet, I reckon he's going to be the next one. He's got everything you could possibly want. His serve, despite being a very small man, his serve's still pretty big. And he's as quick as any around the court. I think he could be the next one to win that Grand Slam, and certainly be an exciting time for Japan if Kai Nishikori manages to win an Australian Open title. I don't know that they've had too many Australian Open winners in recent times, certainly. So Nishikori could be one to look for. On the women's side, there's always the same names that sort of pop up. It's the Serena Williams, Angelique Kerbers. Obviously the last two, the finalists from last year, but hopefully another name or two might pop up, and I think a couple of them are on the return. One of my favourites probably Eugenie Bouchard, sitting in sort of the world number 40 ranked area.
The Genie Army.
Yeah, hopefully the Genie Army might get her a few wins, and you never know with a good draw. She's going to be pretty dangerous, not seeded, so she's going to be a pretty dangerous draw early on. If she gets through the first couple of rounds, you never know. The momentum might keep rolling, but there's still plenty of names that you could probably reel off that are definitely a chance of causing a couple of upsets during the Open, which is always exciting.
And Nishikori is definitely a worthy one to bring up because he boasts an incredibly solid game from backhand to forehand side. His serve is deceptively good, as you said. His height, even though he's not around that 1.90 centimetre bracket, he still serves well, and it tells you some things about technique more than height sometimes. And especially his backhand, he boasts an immense backhand. He angles well across the court, and his footwork. And at the Australian Open, that's very important. You've seen Novak Djokovic have fantastic success at the Australian Open because he just glides around the court like he's on ice. He's just very great to watch in that aspect. He gets the balls that people can't, and Nishikori has that ability as well. So he could definitely go into the tournament. And Jeannie Bouchard, she has a great rapport amongst Australian fans and indeed around the world. She's obviously a really talented player from Canada, I think. From Canada, same with Milos Raonic, who he's another one who could really contend. He made the Grand Slam final this year, didn't he?
Yep, he made the Wimbledon final this year. And yeah, he's certainly making progress very, very quickly as well. Australia certainly suits him as well, the quick, hard courts.
Yeah.
With that massive serve, you never know what he could do. He's a very dangerous player because it's not the easiest trying to break his serve with that sort of speed and that sort of accuracy. So if he gets on a bit of a roll, imagine a Canadian double, Raonic and Bouchard. Certainly we haven't seen Milos win a Grand Slam yet, but along with Nishikori, he's not far away either, I wouldn't have thought, because he's been lurking around the top 5 or 10 in the last 18 months, and could be time for him to make a mark, I think.
Yeah, and if you look at a gap in the tennis game where an upcoming player could seize upon it, it's now, because you have Roger Federer coming back after a long injury layoff, traditionally not that injured at all. He's managed his body pretty well. Djokovic, he is still in good form, but he's not world number one. Murray, still has to prove whether he can consolidate that through the next few Grand Slams. So if I was Nishikori, Raonic, I could be saying, this is my year to potentially, go into the final of a Grand Slam in the Australian Open. And that's the great thing about the Australian Open is that, it's at the start. So there's always fresh surprises. It always makes the tournament quite interesting. I remember watching Tomic and Dolgopolov, and that was a really interesting game because there were two upcoming young guns, and it was played so differently because there was so many slices. I don't know if you... Yeah. They constantly like to slice the ball. And Dolgopolov is one who could, progress a little bit further this year. He has an explosive game. Nadal, he likes the Australian Open. So there's Monfils, of course. How can we not forget?
Always good to watch.
Always great to watch. He's just got so much talent. And, in, the juniors, he was considered to be almost better than Nadal around when they were under 20 years old. So he had enormous talent as a junior, which you wouldn't say he's quite fulfilled because I don't think he's won a Grand Slam.
No, he hasn't. He probably hasn't yet.
Yeah, but I'm sure he's won titles, and he's always been a very consistent player. Always very fun to watch the French. I know you were part of a match between Gilles Simon and Gaël Monfils, and that was an incredible match. That went 5 sets, and both of them had great speed around the court. So some rallies, you would know better than I, but it looked like it would never end.
Yeah, there was some really long rallies that night. I do remember that. That was an epic. That was one of those 5-set epics at the Australian Open that you sort of never forget. If you were there, you definitely remember them for a long time. And hopefully we'll see a few more of those this year.
Absolutely. And how would you describe the court at the Australian Open? How does it match up to other Grand Slams like Roland Garros, Wimbledon in the grass in terms of speed?
Oh, it's much quicker. Definitely much quicker. And obviously in the heat as well. It's a different challenge because when you're at the French or at Wimbledon, it's not quite as hot. And a lot of these courts at Melbourne Park don't have a lot of shade, so they get pretty hot and very, very quick. So the athletic players tend to do much better. The real quick ones around the court, and that's probably why, as you said before, Novak's had so much success because he's a real athlete around the court. Doesn't miss too many balls, so that's the major difference, I suppose, is the speed of the court.
Yeah, absolutely. And the heat you just mentioned, the athletes have to be really well conditioned to go over to Melbourne. Some of these countries that other players are flying over, it's winter or something. So it's always a bit of a drastic change. So you need to get acclimatized to the Melbourne conditions because even for us locals, it can be a bit hot as well.
Yeah. There's plenty of them who come over who are already here or have been here a week or so that give themselves plenty of opportunity to acclimatise, and then before they go to the other tournaments around the country before Melbourne. So tournaments in Brisbane starting on New Year's Day, and obviously we talked about Perth before, so there'll be plenty who'll be around already preparing themselves for 2 weeks' time.
Yeah, absolutely, because the weather is just something you can't afford to skip in your preparation, because especially when you're playing a 5-set match, generally the athlete that is most conditioned will succeed, because it's just such a grueling aspect, especially when you're playing in over 35 degrees. They obviously have the heat rule. When it reaches, what temperature is it?
Oh, it's a very confusing mathematical equation. It's not quite the same. It's not quite one temperature.
Oh, okay.
It's dependent on a few different things. The heat, obviously, but also the humidity and a couple other different things. So it's not necessarily a set number where they call play off for the heat.
That's interesting. So they actually do a mathematical equation.
Yep.
Do you know what that involves?
No. That's too hard for me. It's too complex for me. But I do know it is to do with the heat, humidity, and I feel like there's one other factor which I don't know at the moment. But they put together some sort of equation, and if that spits out a number of, I think it's above about 37, they call it off. So it's very complex, but there's good reason behind it, and a lot of scientific research has gone behind it, no doubt. And it's obviously to protect the health of players, umpires, ball kids, even spectators as well. So there's reason behind it, but it's not as simple as you might think.
Mm-hmm. And it gets rid of some of the guesswork, doesn't it, when you have like an objective measurement in a mathematical equation to actually work it out. Otherwise, what would happen is a player might say, it's too hot for me to play in.
Yeah.
But the other one wants to continue. So it's good to have that objective measurement where, there's a final ruling. It's almost like a judge at a court, it's like stamping their hammer down. There's something there that all players, all officials can go by. And that's a very important thing to have at the Australian Open. I know Novak Djokovic has been talking about him a lot. He actually had to retire against Andy Roddick in the Australian Open one time. And one of the reasons was due to the heat. He just couldn't.
Like that.
Not just Novak Djokovic. That was years ago now, but certainly, acclimatising to the conditions is a huge one, and making sure you can back up for the next game. That's a crucial one as well, and I'd imagine it would be for the ball kid squad too, because if you're officiating a match and it's above 35 degrees, you want to make sure you get water into your system, and ensure that you're well hydrated so that you can manage those conditions. So the Australian Open starts in 18 days?
18 days to go, yep.
18 days. So what is the Ball Kids squad doing at the moment in preparation for that? Because I know you started earlier in the year. Obviously, the Ball Kids squad is probably like the most trained squad in any tennis tournament, really. So, what are you doing at the moment?
Look, we started, as I've probably spoken about here before, we started training sort of during June, July, off the back of trials in sort of March and April. So it's a fairly long process, but they've done sort of probably 6 months of training, sort of every once a month for the last 6 or 7 months. And then finishing last week, we've had what's known as the December Showdown tournament, where we have the National Junior Championships and the Wild Card Playoff, which is for a spot in the Australian Open. And our ball kids sort of use that as their last sort of training before January. So they tend to do 2 or 3 days each of work at the December Showdown, where they get the feel of sort of a tournament atmosphere for those who are sort of brand new. And then at this point right now, they're sort of resting and preparing themselves for what comes in the next couple of weeks. And then from January 10 or 11, when the qualifying period starts, they'll be straight into it. And then obviously 18 days on January 16 is the first day of the main draw tournament, where all the crowds come and it gets really exciting for them. But from January 9 or 10, we start to prepare them with information sessions on the 10th, and then on the 11th is day one of qualifying. So they're into it on that day. So we're not far from that. We're only now about 15 days or something from that, maybe not even that, about 12 days from that first day of qualifying. So it's coming around very, very quickly, but we're also very, very excited because for a lot of us, it's our favourite time of the year. It's 3 weeks that we love every year. We can't wait.
It must be a huge rush of adrenaline, especially for the ball kids who are in their first year, probably officiating their first Australian Open match. I've talked to you a lot about your experiences as a ball kid, but one thing I haven't asked you, I believe, is your debut match. Do you remember that well? And if so, what was that experience like?
I do. My first match that I remember was on Court 5 in 2010, and it featured a young Japanese player by the name of Kai Nishikori. And from what I remember, he played an Italian man whose name is Fabio Fognini.
Yes.
And it was a massive crowd. I do remember that. There was a lot of Japanese support for Nishikori, and he went on to win that match. That was the first round, day one. So the atmosphere was pretty big, and I was a bit on the edge, as you'd imagine. First day of the real stuff. So that was a fair way to start, and then from there, I don't remember a lot of my first year, but that was certainly one that definitely stuck in the memory from that first year was Kai Nishikori. I never really heard of him before that, but from that point on, I've watched his progress pretty closely, and he's turned out all right.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great match to start off with. When you mentioned Fognini there, as an Italian myself, Italians in general can be quite expressive, even around something as simple as a dinner table, but, you constantly speak loud. The culture is very expressive. And you see that with Fognini in a general match. He's had some incidents with officiating umpires and stuff, not being quite happy. He's quite a funny character. I actually don't mind him. But was there any of that against Nishikori?
I do remember that because there was a lot of, as I said before, there was a lot of Japanese support, and he didn't like it. He got quite aggressive, as you said, as Italians can do. He got quite aggressive towards pretty much anyone that was in his vicinity.
Wow.
Security, umpires, us, himself, the crowd, everyone copped it that day. But he ended up losing it in a 5-setter. It was quite a good match, I do remember that.
Yeah.
He was pretty aggressive and pretty frustrated because I do remember he had his chances of winning and couldn't quite win. So, as you can imagine, first round of the Australian Open, he was pretty disappointed, and it certainly showed.
Personalities can play a very big role on the court. Roger Federer has that really cool, calm, collected approach. Nadal is almost animalistic the way he goes about it, very competitive. Whereas someone like Fognini is very aggressive, very expressive. He's not afraid to hold back. One of the players I miss the most that used to do that kind of stuff was Marat Safin. Not that he was a bad player, he was actually an extremely good player. He won the Australian Open, as a matter of fact, against Leighton. And he was an extremely good player, but he used to have those moments where he was a very nice guy. I think that's one thing people don't realise. He's actually a very nice guy. I think he's a politician now in his home country, but he was a very good, nice guy off the court, but he was quite expressive on the court. Sometimes it's about going into that mindset as an athlete that you're there to do battle. Even in another sport, Manny Pacquiao, who's extremely nice, an extremely nice person. You almost, as a boxer, you almost have to have that killer instinct when you go into the ring. It's not necessarily like that in tennis. You want to have a winner's mindset, but some personalities don't quite suit the game of tennis. I know Kyrgios has that almost like flamboyant kind of style on court and off it as well, which helps him in certain instances, but sometimes it doesn't. But one thing I think that suits Kyrgios is that he's a big game player. He's not afraid to go on centre court and deliver on his talents and excel. So he has all the tools to, succeed. Even someone like Conor McGregor, a lot of athletes could take note of, because he's someone who has a lot of self-belief and he replicates it inside the octagon as well. Who do you think has the most, the best personality for the game of tennis on court? Would you say that, Federer's, kind of cool, calm approach, very respectful towards ball kids? He had that famous incident with a ball boy where he hit the ball back and the ball boy caught it with his one hand. Who do you think has the best personality for tennis?
I think Roger probably does. Despite the look that he's got, that cool calm and nothing phases him, he's very competitive. Very, very competitive. He'll come up against anyone, whether he's an 18-year-old kid that's just coming on the tour, or whether it's Novak Djokovic, and have the same sort of mentality. And that's probably something that other players around him probably lack. And those younger players, for example, Nick Kyrgios, who has got all the talent in the world, probably lacks that competitive instinct every single time he steps on the court. And unfortunately it cost him at the end of the year. But Roger Federer probably has that mindset that you want as a tennis player. Nothing really looks like it phases him on the court, but at the same time he's a very, very competitive person, and I think all he wants to do is win, and he makes sure he wins. He makes sure he does what he has to do to win. He doesn't necessarily go about it in a flamboyant, aggressive style that other players do, but he makes sure he gets the job done, and that's what that competitive nature, a competitive sort of person like him, that's all he's after, and he does it pretty well, and he has done for 20 years almost. So, yeah, I think Roger's probably the one you want to emulate if you can.
He has that grit inside him that you don't necessarily see from the outside. But, I mean, the evidence is proof. I mean, if you go back to when he was playing Nadal, one of the best matches ever in the game of tennis, Wimbledon final, watch this on YouTube, the fourth set tiebreak. That was incredible. Just some of the shots, Roger Federer's winning shot, Roger Federer's passing shot, how he stayed in that game, and he almost won it. But Nadal was a very deserving winner, and that was almost like his coming out party in terms of facing the top three and knowing that he could beat players like Federer. And yeah, it's always interesting. It's always an interesting thing. Personalities. Hewitt. He's known as the youngest world number one in the men's game, and he was extremely competitive from an early age. We're talking 18, 17 years old. I mean, he never liked to lose, and he carried that throughout his whole career. And it's why Australians love him, or conversely hate him, because I know some people don't necessarily like his competitive instincts, but he got the best out of himself as a player, and you have to respect that. Federer had issues as well before he made his senior run as a junior, constantly breaking rackets, not really managing anger well, but you learn from your mistakes, and this is something that Tomic, Kyrgios, they can still learn it. They just need to go through the experiences, which they are doing. They are still very young. And I guess being in the public spotlight in Australia, you're always looking for the next kind of Rod Laver, so to speak. Who's going to be that next star? But the fact is that it's very hard now. I mean, the game has grown to a point where girls and men alike, there's no such thing as an easy Grand Slam. You can't necessarily pick someone to win. Obviously Novak Djokovic in his prime was pretty much unbeatable, let's be frank. Some of his matches, you just go, wow, who can beat this guy? But fast forward to now, and he's the second world-ranked player. So, form is temporary, but class is permanent. And, Roger Federer, we'll see how he goes. He has experience at the Australian Open. And obviously, from the girls' game, it's interesting with Sharapova, because obviously when she's playing, she, almost screams a little bit when she hits the ball. And sometimes that can be, if I was someone playing that, that wouldn't suit me. It's almost like, can we get on with the game? But it seems to almost be part of her style. Of course, she's on suspension at the moment.
Yep.
And even Serena Williamson is an extremely competitive player. Won more Grand Slams than Roger, I think.
She has,
So she's one who has that competitive spirit as well. It's always something I look out for with a tennis player, if they have that mentality to withstand, tournament after tournament. Because it's one thing to have the talent, but you have to be mentally strong in the game of tennis. Otherwise, you're just not going to survive. Switching sports, the AFL season, so that's coming, the pre-season that's coming up in a couple of months, with Nathan Freeman making a return to the St Kilda Football Club. By making a return, he hasn't actually debuted in the AFL yet. He's been around the AFL system for more than a few years now, starting from Collingwood, where he was touted as one of the best prospects in his draft, now going to St Kilda, where he hoped to make his debut this year, but he struggled with some injuries, which has been almost his recipe like the last few years, just constantly getting himself in great shape but then breaking down. This time he looks like he's really flying, and I know as a St Kilda supporter that would really excite you, I would imagine.
Absolutely, yeah. I think he's the type of player that you really want. He's quick, he can run, he can use the ball really well, and he's a really powerful sort of player. So if we can get him 100% fit, and it sounds like so far so good, touch wood, he's had a full pre-season, which is certainly exciting, because I think if we slot him into the St Kilda midfield, along with a couple of the recruits that have come across this year, it's looking pretty promising for the next few years, and hopefully 2017 is a bit of a stepping stone towards bigger and better things in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, because certainly the time's been, and we've been waiting a long time, so hopefully we're not far away.
Yeah, and I mean, even this year you saw the St Kilda Football Club come on in leaps and bounds. They've got a very young squad, a very talented young squad. Do you think it's reasonable for them to make the top 8?
Absolutely. I think a bit of luck had gone our way in a couple of the games, particularly against Hawthorn and North Melbourne earlier in the year. We would have been playing in finals. We only missed out on the finals by percentage from North Melbourne. So a bit of luck and we might have made it this year, but that's okay, that doesn't matter. But 2017, I think, with Jake Carlisle coming in, Nathan Brown from Collingwood, and a couple of these midfield recruits as well, plus the continual improvement in a couple of the other players that we've drafted in the last couple of years, in particular Paddy McCartan, to play alongside Josh Bruce and Tim Membry. No doubt that 2017 finals are on the expectations, and you never know, bit of luck, a few good wins against those top 8 teams from last year might be the difference between finishing 9th or 10th and finishing 7th or 8th, which would be what we'd want to do, I'd reckon, next year, and then hopefully push forward again in 2018.
And your experienced players are doing very well, like Rewalt. Is really, quite honestly, one of the best forwards to have played the game, because he, if you look at grand finals, he's come extremely close more than a few times, but when you're ranking players up there in the history of the game, you don't necessarily go by grand finals. You go by, what they can contribute to the team, how much they've contributed to the game in general. It's almost similar to Nathan Buckley, one of the modern greats as well. He never won a grand final. And I've always been very impressed, with his evolution as a player, because he's starting to play a bit more on the wing, similar to Matthew Richardson. When he was playing in his later years, he was deployed on the wing, where he could really use his height, deceptive, agility, balance, general goal nous. And that allows players, as you were saying, Tim Membry, Josh Bruce, Paddy McCartan, who was taken number 1 draft pick, very good contested mark, very good on the lead. I agree with you. I think they could definitely contend for the top 8. Top 4, I don't think so. But top 8 would definitely be a possibility. And you never know with how teams can, evolve throughout pre-season. Port Adelaide had enormous hopes this season and last. Probably didn't quite live up to it, but beforehand, they rose from the bottom 8 right up the ladder. So, this could be St Kilda's year next year. Especially if you can get a player as talented as Nathan Freeman on the field. He's got that, not comparing him to Patrick Dangerfield by any stretch. He's an amazing player, but he does have similar skill assets in his pace. Very good with his endurance, so he can maintain that pace almost all game. Very good kick. And, as a Collingwood supporter myself, I hated that he left the club because I knew how much of a talent he was and how much St Kilda paid for him, which was essentially not a lot. He was worth a first-round draft pick. He was got by St Kilda for a second-round draft pick. We didn't really have a choice. He wanted to leave. I think he was running out of contract as well, so you just have to trade him. And, if you can get him up and running, he's well worth a second-round draft pick, let me tell you that. He could easily slot in there with the likes of Jack Stephen, Armitage leading the way there in the midfield. If you did have players like Freeman and Stephen, imagine the chaos Freeman and Stephen could cause with their running ability.
Yeah, that speed is frightening. Those two are two of the quickest midfielders going around. So if you got them off the leash, it'd be pretty dangerous, I'd imagine. Plus with players like, as you said, David Armitage feeding the ball out to him, Seb Ross, Luke Dunstan in the middle of the ground. So there's plenty of optimism, I think, around the Saints in next year. And certainly I'm one of those who think that finals is well and truly on the agenda. And you never know. I think we saw with the Western Bulldogs this year, finished 7th at the end of the home and away season. Had a bit of luck in September and all of a sudden they're the defending premier. So you just never know when you get into September now. I think the competition's so tight that anyone can win on any day. Whether it's in their home state or not, as the Dogs proved, they went to Perth, beat the West Coast, and then went to Sydney and beat the Giants. So you just never know. A bit of luck in September if you can get there. You just never know what could happen. You play your best footy in September, which is what every team will strive to do. If you play that best footy, you really never know what could happen. And there's plenty of teams who feel like they probably are capable of winning the premiership next year. Obviously the Bulldogs again, the Swans who were so close but couldn't quite. And then there's teams like West Coast, Adelaide, Geelong, even probably to a lesser extent Hawthorn, even though they're still around the mark for sure. And then even a team like Melbourne who probably expect to play finals again next year for the first time in 10 years. So there's a lot to like about next year. Plenty of teams who will challenge, who feel like they should challenge. And then there's, of course, a team like, as you mentioned before, Port Adelaide, who have everything you could possibly hope. With the return of Paddy Ryder in the ruck, that was probably their biggest deficiency last year. They lacked a bit in the ruck, but with him coming back and their pretty dangerous midfield, plus a gun forward line, bloke like Chad Wingard, I take him every day of the week. So you just never know what they could do on that home ground at Adelaide Oval. They're pretty hard to beat no matter who they're playing, so you just never know what they could do. West Coast and Fremantle were terrible last year, but with the return of Nat Fyfe and Aaron Sandilands, they could be anything. So there's plenty of teams who are going to be around the mark, which is exciting. There's not too many that you would think are out of contention right at the moment. Probably about 4 or 5, maybe, if that. Carlton, Brisbane, Essendon, maybe Richmond. Other than that, not too many are out of contention. So it's going to be an exciting 2017 season as well, I think.
Even someone like Essendon, you just don't know what's going to happen when you have inclusions like Dyson Heppel, Joe Watson, David Myers. These are, very solid players. Heppel's obviously a gun. And, who knows what Essendon can do. Some commentators were saying they wouldn't win a game this year, and they surprised quite a few teams. I think Melbourne was one of those teams. So, you just don't quite know. And especially Joe Watson, he looks in absolutely great physical nick. I was like, he looks like he's had a very good pre-season, in 2016. So it'll be interesting to see how he goes. Obviously, he gave up the Brownlow medal, where he essentially vacated it, and Cochin and Sam Mitchell were the recipients of that award. I was a bit 50-50 on how it was adjudicated. I wasn't sure whether, if Cochin and Mitchell deserved to win the Brownlow, because you can't really take away that Jobe Watson had one of the best, or if not the best season according to the umpires. So it's almost like you're backtracking to the next available person to win the Brownlow. In this case, it was Cochin and Mitchell. Dane Swan was actually one vote away from getting his second Brownlow medal as well that year. So it was, it's quite a thing to go down the list. But obviously, Cochin and Sam Mitchell have proven themselves to be gun players. What did you think about that whole thing?
I think it probably ended the way it should have. As much as Jobe had a really good year in 2012, reality was, whether we know it or not, there is the potential that he was under performance-enhancing drugs. Clearly, by the sound of the way Stephen Dank's talking, no one's ever going to know exactly what they took, but there is the possibility that it was illegal, and it seems to have been dismissed by a number of different sports authorities and sports courts. So they've basically been found guilty, whether they like it or not.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, whether he wanted to keep it, he had no choice, because basically they've decided they cheated, which means his season was void in some ways, despite it being a very, very good one. He couldn't possibly have held on to the Brownlow, and as a result, I don't think they wanted to have a Brownlow medal where no one won. So Sam Mitchell and Trent Cotchin, who had terrific seasons in 2012, deserved what they got. Sam Mitchell got his team into a grand final. Unfortunately, they didn't quite get the job done against the Swans in that year. And Trent Cotchin, that was sort of in some ways his breakout year, but it was also a year in which he won the Brownlow medal as a 22-year-old, I think, which is a pretty significant effort.
Quite amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it was probably the season that Richmond felt that they were about to have, and start of something pretty special for them. Clearly, it hasn't quite worked out. They made 3 consecutive final series and didn't quite get across the line in any of those series, and now they seem to be going backwards again. So that would be disappointing for Cochin and Richmond, but can't take away anything from his 2012 season, which was something pretty special. Yes. I think he looked like he was going to be a multiple Brownlow medalist after that season. He hasn't quite probably got back to that level just yet, but for his sake, you'd want to hope that Richmond will start to improve again, and maybe people around him will help him and he can get there again, because that 2012 season was a pretty special one from Cochin.
And he's very clean with his hands, and it's about, sometimes it's about having the support around you, which I think Richmond have sometimes been a little guilty of. I mean, they don't have Deledio anymore. He went to... did you mention GWS? I mean, GWS is... Yeah, I mean, they've got very experienced recruits, but not just experienced recruits, like legitimately good players. Heath Shaw, Shane Mumford, Brett Deledio is an absolute gun forward as centre. So they have some, great players, and their young list is amazing. So you just got to think, what can GWS do? I mean, they were, less than a goal away from the grand final.
I think they're well and truly the premiership favourites at this point. I think, look out with Brett Deledio and Stevie Johnson in the forward line at the Giants next year to go alongside Jonathan Patton and Jeremy Cameron. It's a dangerous, dangerous team, and I think they've proved themselves to be a pretty lethal side, particularly on their home ground, but even when they came to Melbourne especially and played under the roof at Etihad on that super quick ground, they were frighteningly good.
Yeah.
And are going to be good for a long time too. With that enormous amount of first-round draft pick talent, they're going to be amazing. Next year, I think, will be their year. They're going to be very hard to beat for a premiership. The only thing that's going to stop them is whether they just can't get it done on grand final day at the MCG, I think, because they don't play a lot of footy at the MCG. They might play 1 or 2 games a year there. And if they finish top 2, they won't play there again until the grand final. So if they don't choke on grand final day, basically, I think they're going to be pretty hard to beat in the season, because they are the best team in it by a mile. They probably let themselves down a little bit in that preliminary final against the Bulldogs, particularly with their kicking for goal. and the Bulldogs took their chance and made the most of it a week later, obviously. But I think the way that the Giants played that first final against the Swans was scary good. They just looked way too good for Sydney, and off the back of Sydney's amazing season, that was sort of an ominous sign for the competition that if it wasn't going to be this year, it's coming pretty soon, because the Giants are well and truly on the march, and I think 2017 is going to be their year, and it'll be a way and a half for Stevie J, I reckon, to bow out as another premiership under his belt, 4-time premiership player. He was very close, I think, to All-Australian again this year, and just to add Delidio in there, add a couple others that they've drafted. It's pretty frightening what they could do this year coming, but also 2018, 19, 20, 21, 22, with all that talent that they've got, they're going to be a damn good side, for sure.
And you compare them to someone like Gold Coast, because they were an expansion team as well. They're a team which haven't quite got off the mark the way GWS has. Do you think that the recruitment of Gary Ablett has almost stagnated a little bit of their development? Obviously, he's won a Brownlow medal. I don't think personally that he was a great captain to have. I don't think some of his, he was one of the best players that has ever played the AFL. But as a captain, he's not very vocal on the field, and sometimes you need that kind of general, like a Luke Hodge, someone that can, address, what the team needs. Whereas I think Gary Ablett was almost in a league of his own, and a lot of burden went to him. And now that he's been injured, it's almost like, no one's kind of filling in the void. Obviously, they've been a bit unlucky. Jago O'Meara had injury concerns, and quite similar to Nathan Freeman in some ways. The club, the former club, kept at it, but ultimately these players wanted a new change, and Jago going to Hawthorn really hinders that development, because he's an absolute gun. I think people forget just how good he was. He almost started off like Chris Judd did in his early years, with Ben Cousins, Daniel Kerr. That was a phenomenal midfield. So, and you include the inclusion of Tom Mitchell in the Hawthorn squad, and you have a damn good midfield. And it just shows you the experience and the nous of the Hawthorn recruiters. So they've been thinking, we need to regenerate the list, which they have already been doing. Their squad's not that old, really.
Not anymore.
Nah. So you have players like Ben McAvoy, who can fill a void in the ruck, and you've got now Tom Mitchell, Jago O'Meara. Sam Mitchell was like a very loyal player, a phenomenal player, still is a great player, but they ultimately let him go to West Coast, and West Coast is another team, you never know if they're premiership worthy, but the loss of Nick Natanui hurts them a lot. I don't think Drew Petrie quite covers that as well. But what do you think about the Gold Coast? Gary Ablett, he's a star of the competition. He's in his 30s though. He's had a couple of injury installed years. And with the loss of Jago O'Meara, I just don't really see how they're going to do next year.
To be honest, I reckon the Gold Coast will surprise a lot of people next year. If Gary Ablett can get himself fit, he'll probably play in the midfield, despite the fact he could be the best forward in the competition. Yeah. But you look at that forward line in particular, and the defence as well, it's as good as they get, really. Tom Lynch, despite having just about the worst midfield in the competition last year, still managed to kick 65 goals. Combine that with the man they call the 2-metre Peter Wright, who's only going to get better after another year. That's a very dangerous forward line. Plus a few of those smaller players like your Brandon Materas and Aaron Halls, those sort of names that float around the forward line. It's a dangerous forward line, and with Stephen May and Rory Thompson centre half back and full back, it's very, very dangerous, and they're hard to score against, but they struggled to win the ball in the midfield. If Gary Ablett can slot himself back in there, and a couple of those names that they've recruited, For example, Pierce Hanley and Jared Lyons, who's come from the Adelaide Crows, of course, ex-D-Lar boy. He's come from the Adelaide Crows. So there's 3 or 4 that they've picked up. They're not necessarily the household names of Gary Ablett, but they're going to contribute, and they're going to be very, very good players in that starting 22, and they're going to play 22 games. Pierce Hanley struggled a bit at the Lions towards the end of last year, but I think with a fresh start at the Gold Coast, he's a very, very good player who's going to help them enormously. And with Jared Lyons as well, he had a massive year in 2016, but couldn't quite hang on to a spot at Adelaide with so many players coming in and out of there. They couldn't quite offer him the contract he was probably after. As much as they wanted to keep him and as much as he wanted to stay, he feels like the Gold Coast offer and the Gold Coast opportunity was sort of too hard to refuse, and I think he's going to be a big player in 2017 for the Suns. So I think they'll surprise a few. They're starting to build a little bit something there, and with Tom Lynch and Steve May taking over as captains, it's certainly a good time, I reckon, to jump on board the Gold Coast, because I think they're coming good, and you just never know. I think they might surprise a few this year.
Yeah, especially an experienced player as well they've picked up is Barlow from Fremantle.
Well, yeah.
So he's...
That's a dangerous midfield. When you look at that, you got Gary Ablett, Michael Barlow, Jared Lyons, Pierce Hanley, plus a few of the extras that they've had who probably were their first and second and third midfielders this year. They now become their 5th, 6th and 7th midfielders, which gives them enormous improvement and makes it a bit easier on those players to do what they probably wanted to do before. And if David Swallow can get himself fit as well, he's a damn good footballer. Unfortunately, we probably haven't seen the best of him. But if he can get himself 100% fit and play 22 games next year, I reckon they're in contention. They're in contention for a spot in September again, because they were a couple of years ago when they were very, very good before Gary Ablett got himself injured, and then they sort of fell down a bit. But since then, they've struggled with a lot of injuries. But if they can get themselves fit and keep as many of their players on the park for 22 games next year, they're going to be pretty good, I reckon.
Yeah.
And at home, they're hard to beat. So I reckon they're going to surprise a few, and who knows, they may feature in September next year.
Yeah, I mean, you raise, very good points. I mean, at the start, I was like, what can Gold Coast do now that they've lost some players? But when you go through their list, forward, back, and mid, you realise that injuries have played an enormous role in their development. And, with the likes of David Swallow coming back in, number 1 draft pick, Aaron Hall continuing his development, someone like Jack Martin, loads of potential. A little bit similar to Adam Goods in a way, quite a versatile player.
And a couple of these players they've picked up in the draft, I know.
Ainsworth.
Ben Ainsworth, and there was a lot of people impressed with Jack Bowes, who was an academy player at the Gold Coast, and he's going to be a pretty exciting addition to the Suns as well. So a couple of extra midfielders there. So they're going to be a good team, I reckon. I reckon it may not be this year that they play in September, but I reckon they're not far away, and they're going to challenge plenty of those better teams again, which they did probably 2 years ago. But the last 18 months they've struggled a bit particularly against the top teams. But I reckon 2017, on their home ground at Metricon, they're going to challenge a few of those better teams again, which is exciting for them because they've probably struggled over the last 2 years and they've copped a fair bit of criticism. But with Rodney Eade as coach and that sort of lineup, they're going to be pretty dangerous, I reckon.
Yeah, I mean, the talent's there. It's about just, managing the injuries and, some of it's just a luck factor. It's a brutal game, AFL. It requires a lot of maintenance of injuries. Sometimes you're playing a game and you're not quite 100% fit, but that's just the nature of the game itself. But with the Gold Coast, some of it wasn't necessarily soft tissue injuries, but some of it was, Gary Ablett's shoulder, David Swallow, I think it was a knee issue, yeah. So they're getting some of these players back. And my query is, how well can they integrate into this season, having not had too much consolidation with each other recently. So that's my concern. But the talent is undoubtable. You have a forward line which, compare it to Patton and Jeremy Cameron, I mean, it's a very good...
To me, it's just as good, I reckon.
Yeah.
Those two could be anything. 2 metres tall, both of them, and they both run around like they're midfielders, so
Yeah.
they could be anything, I reckon.
Yeah, I mean...
May not be this year, but they're not far away.
Yeah, and defenders would have an absolute nightmare matching up on those opponents because...
Wouldn't be fun.
No, you need to make sure, you have the height, and if you don't have the height, just, try and just, shake them off their game because, Tom Lynch, 65 goals you mentioned, and that's with a midfield that didn't have all its best players. So
and he's the best contested mark in the game at the moment. And the best key forward at the moment is Tom Lynch, and with a good team around him, look out. He could kick 100.
On the topic of key forwards, this brings up another contentious point, and that is Travis Cloke to the Western Bulldogs. Now, as a Collingwood supporter, it was a right decision for him. I think Bulldogs have got a very exciting style of play which could suit Travis Cloke if they can get the ball to him quickly, as they've shown. I mean, the Bulldogs are a phenomenal side. But the query is with Cloke whether he can help or whether he's just going to be someone who is playing in the VFL a little bit and also the AFL. Because what you don't want is you don't want a player like that to restrict the development of not a Tom Boyd. He's someone who might thrive off Cloke's presence, but other taller forwards. So what do you think of that recruitment? Do you think Travis Cloke will help the Western Bulldogs?
It's an interesting one. I think the way that Tom Boyd played in September, to go with Jordan Roughhead in the ruck, I'm just not 100% sure he fits in. Because if you've got those two up and firing like they were, obviously Roughhead plays first ruck and Tom Boyd plays as the full forward. And the way that the Bulldogs play, I'm not sure that they want two massive forwards like those two. Because their second tall forward was that Zane Cordy, who was sort of 193, 194, but more of a sort of half forward midfielder who can play as that taller player. So I'm not sure whether Travis Cloke is going to be a certain starter because of the way he plays. But I think when he's in that team, he'll make an enormous contribution because, as you said, I think the way that the Bulldogs play is probably going to help him more than the way Collingwood played because he's a real runner. And his contested marking's probably dropped off a little bit in the last 18 months. So I think if you can get him on the run, he could be a definite thing that helps the Bulldogs. But I'm not sure whether he fits in from round one if Tom Boyd, Jordan Roughhead, Zane Cordy are all 100% fit and ready to go because the way they performed in the finals, it's hard to sort of deny them a spot then in round one next year.
And it's all about, as a key forward, kind of evolving your game, and that's something that everyone can learn off, Nick Riewoldt in a way, the way he evolved his game from, not just staying in the forward line, but also moving out of it to aid the development of, a Josh Bruce, a Paddy McCartan. And it'll be interesting to see. I mean, one of the reasons why they got in Travis Cloke was to have another one of those Tom Boyd types that, drags the, one of the top key defenders and, potentially lets, Tom Boyd loose. And Travis Cloke is used to having the best defender on him every match. So he's definitely going to help. If anything, he's going to help drag the attention away from Tom Boyd, because what you can't do with Travis Cloke, you can't just put like a B grade defender on him, because like you said, he's a runner. He's got one of the best endurance capacities in the competition as a key forward. Riewoldt is obviously the top, but a close second, I would think, would be Travis Cloke. That's an underrated aspect of his game. Like, he's a very good long distance runner. And contested marking might not matter as much if the Bulldogs can get it to him quickly. It's more about whether he's one-on-one or he has like two defenders on him, because if he's one-on-one, he's more likely than not to mark the ball or give it to the Crummers they have, Luke Dalhouse, those type of players.
I think that's what frustrated him at Collingwood last year. Particularly, they were slow, sort of moving the ball. Did like using the boundary line a lot, and it probably meant that he had two or three players playing on him by the time the ball got anywhere near him. So that definitely would have frustrated him towards the end of the year especially, and that's sort of why he probably chose the Bulldogs, because he felt like that was the team that was going to make a difference for him, and he was going to be able to make a difference to them. So I think Travis Cloke will have a good year. He'll have a better year than he did this year for sure. And if he can play his best footy, then the Bulldogs are going to be pretty good, I reckon. Again, they're going to be hard to beat for another premiership. I think it could be... I'm going to go the other prediction. I think it's going to be the Giants and the Bulldogs in the grand final this year, because the way that preliminary final panned out was one of the best games of footy you'll ever see. And I think both of those teams will improve again, and it's going to be a good year for both of those two, I think. I think they could be the grand finalists for 2017.
Absolutely. I mean, their lists are quite, they're quite stocked for talent, young and experienced players, and could well be a Bulldogs and GWS grand final.
I think so.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, I'd like to thank Joshua for coming on the show, and I hope you liked the show as well. The AFL season is coming up next year, and obviously the Australian Open is 18 days away, so looking forward to it.
Can't wait.